Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thank you for joining me for the first of your weekend video cast. Today we're looking at David Christian's book, This Fleeting World. Now, normally we would cover about 30 to 40 pages or so from your textbook, but because this outline summary involves an entire book of well over 100 pages, this video is just a bit longer than usual. Hang in there though, and pause and repeat if necessary in order to fill out your outline, record the buzzwords, and write your summary, all of which are due Monday. Also, make sure you have your big history handouts with you. In the prequel section of This Fleeting World, Christian defines his project. Big history, as you will remember from his TED Talk, is Christian's attempt to place human history into the larger context of the history of the universe. To tell this story, he divides time into a series of thresholds or moments of increasing complexity. Incidentally, the word threshold is the first buzzword to record on the back of your outline. Do it now. Of the 8 threshold moments, Christian identifies the last 3, which occurred only very recently in the history of the universe, involve human beings. This fleeting world, then, is Christian's account of world history within the larger context of big history. So what exactly is the story he tells us in this book? Christian begins his story with the appearance of humans on planet Earth. The era of foragers is a time in which all human beings were nomadic, which means they moved around as they hunted and gathered their food rather than growing or manufacturing it. Historians often refer to this period as the Paleolithic era, or Old Stone Age, because stone tools represented the height of human technology. However, studying the era of foragers is difficult because the era generated no documentary evidence since writing had not been invented yet. Consequently, our studies are based primarily on the physical remains from past societies, such as bones and stones, and by making observations of the few modern foraging communities that survive. Where do humans come from is a question as old as humanity itself. Indeed, the answer to this question has become the foundations for many of the world's myths and religions. But modern science has posited 2 theories to try to explain the evidence. However, the first of these, the multi-regional hypothesis, has become largely discredited as a result of genetic studies. At this point in time, the overwhelming majority of scientists accept the out-of-Africa hypothesis, which suggests that all modern humans are descended from just a few ancestors who lived about 250,000 years ago in Africa and then migrated around the rest of the globe. We will closely examine the evidence used to support this theory in class. The most powerful feature that distinguishes human beings is symbolic language, a system of arbitrary symbols that can be linked by formal grammars to create a nearly limitless variety of precise utterances. Symbolic language is the basis of what Christian calls collective learning, and it allowed humans to adapt to the varied environments throughout the world better than any other species. Christian coined the term lifeways to describe the way of life for a given group of people, as opposed to the term lifestyle, which has certain modern connotations. By analogy with surviving forager communities, we know that foragers were mobile and lived in relatively small groups of around 30 people or so. What else can we deduce about the way they lived? Well, we know that their primary social organization was based on extended family groups. Kith and kin are both words to describe family relationships. Moreover, as each group normally had family members in neighboring groups, kinship ensured that people usually had some sense of solidarity with other groups, which in turn limited violent conflicts between different groups. Foragers probably experienced their standard of living as affluent or well-to-do because the things they needed could be found all around them. Nomadism discourages the accumulation of material possessions because one can only possess what one can easily carry from place to place. To us, that may seem like they were poor, but to them, they had everything they needed. Hunting and gathering food may be challenging, but compared to the farmers that will emerge in the next era, foragers lived a life with plenty of free time to create, tell stories, and strengthen social bonds. What's more, their diet was much more varied and nutritious than that of later farmers. Nonetheless, life expectancies were low compared to our standards, with nearly half of all children dying before the age of 10 and the average lifespan of an adult being just under 30 years. By comparison with later eras of human history, the rate of change in the era of foragers was extremely slow. partly because exchanges of information were limited by the small size and the wide dispersion of foraging communities. Even so, significant changes did occur. Humans are the only species to learn how to control fire, for example. And over time, humans began to modify materials from their natural environment, such as wood, bone, and stone, to create increasingly sophisticated tools designed for very specific purposes. Another change began about 100,000 years ago. Some humans began to settle beyond Africa and into Asia and Europe. Eventually, they made it to Australia and the Americas. These migrations demonstrate enormous creativity as humans had to adapt to many different environments throughout the world. Generally speaking, foragers had a minimal impact on the natural environment around them, but despite the fact that they lived in small groups and were constantly on the move, foragers did affect the environment in two significant ways. Within the last 50,000 years, many species of large animals, or megafauna, have become extinct. While megafauna were certainly overhunted, particularly in regions like North America that were newly settled by humans, it also appears that climate change may have contributed to these extinctions. Like regular farming, fire stick farming is a way of manipulating the natural environment to increase the productivity of animals and plant species that humans find useful. For example, some fire stick farmers burned off the land to encourage the growth of fresh grass, which in turn attracts the animals that eat the grass. These animals are then more easily hunted for food. From about 50,000 years ago, the rate of technological change appears to have accelerated. As humans migrated to new continents and new environments, they required new technologies and tools to help them adapt. For example, bone sewing needles began to appear where humans required heavier clothing in colder climates. Some affluent foragers adopted more intensive techniques that allowed them to extract more resources from a given area, allowing them to create larger communities that were semi-sedentary or more stationary, which meant that they had to move around less frequently. Intensification is the second buzzword to record on the back of your outline. Whereas foragers had to move over larger areas to extract more resources, extensification, affluent foragers moved less and extracted more. Intensification, therefore, is the key in the coming transition to agriculture, as we'll see shortly. It is worth remembering that the era of foragers is by far the longest period in the story of human beings on planet Earth. But because writing had not been invented yet, this period of so-called prehistory has been seen by many scholars as not worthy of study in the story of world history. And yet, by exploiting synergy, the creative power generated by linking people together, humans slowly learned to adapt successfully in a wide variety of new environments. Collective learning, made possible by symbolic language, allowed humans to prosper globally more so than any other species on the planet. Consequently, the era of foragers provides the foundation for the next threshold moment. During the era of foragers, the pace of change was relatively slow over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. By contrast, the pace of change is much faster in the agrarian era, even though it's only about 10,000 years long. Christian defines the agrarian era as the era of human history when agriculture was the most important of all productive technologies and the foundation for most human societies. The era ends, in Christian's account, when industrial technologies overtake agriculture as the primary means of production and becomes the foundation for human lifeways. The era begins, however, when humans learn to domesticate plants and animals for food instead of hunting and gathering them. Christian uses the term agriculture to describe the ways in which plant and animal species were manipulated to increase the intensification of food production in a given area. But where did the idea to domesticate plants and animals begin, and how did it spread? We know that grains, or cereal crops, were first cultivated in the region known as the Fertile Crescent from about 8,000 before the Common Era. However, it is not the case that all agriculture spread from the Fertile Crescent. Instead, the domestication of plants and animals appears to have radiated spontaneously and quite independently from several key regions throughout the world. This is a very important point that we will examine much more closely in class. Climate change appears to have helped certain affluent foragers adapt with increasing precision and efficiency to local environments in order to extract more resources from a given area than traditional foragers. Such intensification allowed affluent foragers to become semi-sedentary, which means they moved around much less frequently. We will examine how climate change may have affected the development of agriculture in more detail in class. In some regions of abundance, restraints to limit population growth were no longer necessary and may have been relaxed. This led to population growth, which in turn required even more intensive food production. Consequently, in those regions with plants and animals available for domestication, people developed new stone tools to help produce food, hence the term Neolithic, and they became completely sedentary, which meant they no longer moved at all to find their food. After agriculture appeared in any one region, it spread, according to Christian, primarily because populations of farming communities grew so fast that they had to find new land to farm. The migration of farmers in search of new land is only one way in which agriculture spread, however. In class, we will examine how another process, diffusion, also affected the spread of agriculture throughout the world. Despite the fact that domestication increased the pace of change throughout this era, there are certain continuities or characteristics that remained the same, which persisted until the Industrial Revolution. The first of these continuities is that the overwhelming majority of all humans lived in villages. Villages are small, stable communities of farming households that have no centralized state system, but that require cooperation in order to plant and harvest crops. Even as urban civilizations developed and grew, most people were organized in decentralized villages throughout the world. A second continuity is increasing populations. The increased productivity of agriculture ensured that human populations grew much faster than they had during the era of foragers. Indeed, even as plagues might decrease population in a given time and place, the overall trend is that human populations increased in nearly every region of the world. Population pressures demanded technological innovations to increase food production. This trend continued to spur new technologies throughout the era, but two early innovations were crucial. First, from about 4000 before the Common Era, a series of innovations allowed farmers in Afro-Eurasia to make efficient use of secondary products of large livestock, those products that could be exploited without slaughtering the animals, including milk, fibers for cloth, and manure for fertilizer. Consequently, many animals were used more for their muscle power during their lifetimes, being consumed for their meat only after they had died. Another early series of innovations, irrigation for growing crops, may have had an even larger impact on food production. Irrigation farmers learned to divert small streams onto their fields, to create new farmland by filling swamps with soil and refuse, and to build systematic networks of canals and dams to serve entire regions. Indeed, irrigation techniques would continue to improve food production throughout the agrarian era. But not all trends were positive. While foraging communities were largely free of epidemic diseases because they were small and mobile, farming communities created more favorable environments for pathogens. Close contact with livestock, accumulations of rubbish, and overpopulation contributed to the spread of disease. This was compounded by the expansion of trade networks, which allowed pathogens to spread over even larger territories. Another negative trend is the growing inequality among people. In many regions, food surpluses grew large enough to support elite groups whose livelihoods depended entirely on their ability to control and manage the resources produced by other people, either through the threat of force or the exchange of goods and services. Throughout this era, nomadic foragers and pastoralists living outside the main agricultural regions continued to have a significant impact on agrarian communities by introducing new technologies or by linking agrarian regions through a network of trade in valuable goods. In Christian's account of human history, he divides each of the three major eras into subordinate eras by time. Note that subordinate eras are divided by time, as we will come back to this point later. The first subordinate era of the agrarian era begins with the advent of agriculture, and it lasted for about 5,000 years. After the practice of agriculture had spread more or less globally, villages formed around the demands of agriculture and appeared in regions throughout the world. During this subordinate era, villages were the largest human communities on Earth, and the most important sources of demographic and technological dynamism. As villages became larger, people had to find new ways of defining their relationships with their neighbors. Who would administer justice? Who would manage access to stored resources? And who would organize trade, warfare, and religious worship? These questions led to the creation of institutionalized hierarchies, with those who controlled wealth at the top and everyone else at the bottom. Similarly, men began to claim superiority based on their role in emerging power structures outside the household, and women were increasingly defined by their role within the household and by their relationships to men. Thus we see the beginnings of patriarchy, or social inequality based on gender. Early leadership depended largely on popular consent, a system known as chiefdoms. However, as communities expanded, the resources available to the leaders increased until they began to set aside a share of those resources to support specialist enforcers of power, or rudimentary armies. Soon we see the development of kingdoms. This subordinate era, which lasted about 2,500 years, is where most traditional accounts of world history begin, largely because we have written documents as part of a system we call civilization. While civilizations had written records, they also had, among several other things, states, which is a term used to denote a central authority to control surplus food and labor and to administer justice. In this context of world history, a state means a centralized government, as opposed to the way we think of a state as Tennessee is part of the United States. Some of the earliest states appeared around 3000 before the Common Era in southern Mesopotamia, in a region known to archaeologists as Sumer, and also along the Nile River in modern Egypt and Sudan. Later, cities and states appeared also in the Indus River Valley and in northern China. States like the Olmec and Chavin would later appear in Mesoamerica and in the Andes region of South America. The spread of agriculture increased the scale and density of human populations. Soon urban civilizations began to appear throughout the world, relying on the production of agrarian villagers. Urbanization led to increased taxation, the creation of larger armies, and the construction of symbols of power like monumental architecture, among other features we will study in class. Sargon of Akkad may have established the first imperial state in Mesopotamia, but the idea of empire would quickly spread. As states expanded, they taxed and administered larger areas, either directly or indirectly through local rulers. Imperialism would become a key feature of the next subordinate era. States and empires proliferated during this subordinate era over about 1,500 years. Religions were created and used in various ways to consolidate imperial power. Trans-regional trade routes linked people in new ways. This subordinate era includes what we call the classical era in our course of study of world history. The Achaemenids, who created a Persian empire in the 6th century before the Common Era, marked a significant increase in state power. But other major empires of the period include the Han Dynasty in China, the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, and the Maurya and Gupta empires in India. Religions were also created and used to further the aims of empire throughout the subordinate era, but the creation of Dar al-Islam after the 7th century of the Common Era represented a new kind of civilization. After the fall of the Olmecs, the great imperial city of Teotihuacan in Mexico controlled trade networks reaching across much of Mesoamerica. Further southeast, the Mayan civilization consisted of a large number of city-states, and in South America, the Moche state of northern Peru dominated the Andes. As trade routes developed, the idea of states and empires soon began to spread throughout the world into new areas like the steppes of Central Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, and North America. Moreover, human migrations into the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans also expanded agriculture and interregional contacts in this subordinate era. This subordinate era represents a transition in most accounts of world history. On the one hand, agriculture continued to be the primary mode of production through the work of both humans and animals. On the other hand, developments after 1492 would change global patterns of trade and interaction. Even so, most humans experienced their lifeways in traditional manners. This subordinate era lasted about 750 years. The first trans-regional networks of exchange, the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean, the Trans-Saharan, and other trade routes, linked regions and generated commercial and intellectual synergy, but the Americas remained separate from the Afro-Eurasian networks. This would change, though, when the Columbian Exchange linked both the Old World and the New World into one global network. The phrase Columbian Exchange is the third buzzword to record. While there were large-scale trade networks before 1492, the linking of the Eastern and Western hemispheres would dramatically transform the lifeways of humans throughout the world. For example, the impact of global networks was not beneficial for Native Americans. Eurasian pathogens such as smallpox decimated the Aztec and Inca empires and secured precious metals for the Spanish. At the same time, though, the exchange of goods, especially food crops, between the Americas and Afro-Eurasia stimulated population growth throughout Afro-Eurasia. In the end, the long-term impact of the Columbian Exchange remains controversial. The introduction of agricultural techniques in this era raised productivity, increased populations, and stimulated innovation. It has been estimated that as much as 70% of all the human beings who ever lived on this planet were born and died in the agrarian era. Consequently, the rate of change is much greater than in the era of foragers. Even so, the rate of change is about to increase dramatically as we enter the modern era. While the era of foragers was several hundreds of thousands of years long and the agrarian era was about 10,000 years long, the modern era is only about 3 centuries or so far, and yet more changes occurred in this time than in any period of human history before. But why? Clearly, for Christian, the Industrial Revolution is the reason why. But accounting for these changes is problematic primarily because we are living in this era, making objectivity difficult. Nonetheless, we have more statistical data to help us out than any time before. So what trends can we see in the era since 1750? In 1750, the world's population was about 770 million. By 2000, the number of humans had reached almost 6 billion. That's close to an 8-fold increase in just 250 years. This demographic explosion occurred in large part because of a dramatic increase in productivity, as humans exploited new technologies for food production and new sources of energy after the Industrial Revolution. During the agrarian era, most people lived in farming villages of less than 100 people. By the end of the 20th century, nearly half of the world's population lived in towns or cities of 5,000 people or more. Innovations in industrialization, transportation, and communications transformed the nature of work. By the 21st century, more people made a living in commercial activities than in agricultural production for the first time in human history. The huge bureaucracies of modern states are also a byproduct of the modern revolution. And while the growth of democracy and nationalism may suggest that modern governments are more reluctant to impose their will by force, in fact, they have much more administrative and coercive power than did rulers of the agrarian era. Moreover, political power is increasingly dependent on the commercial and economic success of the state. Commercial and economic success means that wealth has accumulated faster than ever before, And yet, the gap between the rich and the poor continues to grow. Improvements in food production, sanitation, and medicine have increased gross domestic production, but increasing GDP has not spread the wealth evenly, both within countries and between countries in various regions of the world. New energy sources, new technologies, and contraception have allowed parents to more easily share in the task of caring for infants, and urbanization and commercialization have created more varied forms of employment for women. Nonetheless, gender inequality still survives in some form everywhere throughout the world. Until the 20th century, independent communities of foragers and pastoralists survived in many parts of the world. But by the start of the 21st century, there were nearly no nomads who lived outside a modern state anywhere in the world. While historians generally agree on what the key features of modernity since 1750 are, the question of why these features even occurred at all is contentious. Nonetheless, several factors are clearly evident. Modern methods of agriculture, water management, warfare, mining, transportation, tax collections, communications, etc., continued to improve upon the methods that were originally developed during the agrarian era. In other words, modern production built upon previous models. A close link between innovation and commercialization has always existed. The slow commercialization of societies that occurred throughout the agrarian era probably raised productivity by stimulating innovation. Those societies who benefited most from this process gained the most power. Linking world zones into a single global network after 1492 provided a sharp stimulus to commercial growth and technological innovation. A huge variety of new goods, ideas, and labor entered into global circulation as a result of the Columbian Exchange, benefiting some societies more than others. Because of its geographic proximity to the Americas, Western Europe was well suited to profit from the vast flow of goods, ideas, and labor within this global exchange. The scientific revolution, along with movable type printing, ensured that new information circulated easily throughout the West. Geographical factors like climate change and the presence of large, relatively accessible seams of coal in Britain, northwestern Europe, and the United States also likely affected the modern revolution. Indeed, geography goes a long way in explaining the start of the Industrial Revolution. England and much of Britain was now deforested, but it had a ready supply of coal just below the surface of the earth. In Christian's accounting of the story, the Industrial Revolution unfolded in three waves. In the first wave, during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, new technologies appeared in Great Britain using coal, steam engines, and spinning machines. The second wave occurred during the middle decades of the 19th century, when steam engines mounted on wheels created the first locomotives throughout the British Empire. The third wave occurred during the second half of the 19th century, when industrial technology spread globally into Northern Europe, then to North America, and finally into Russia and Japan. Industrialization produced astonishingly high growth in productivity and populations in Western Europe and North America, growth that was unmatched globally. Indeed, the increasing economic and military might of the industrialized West undermined the traditional agrarian societies dominant in China, India, the Ottoman Empire, and West Africa. While the first modern democratic political systems emerged in the United States, Western Europe, and Latin America during the turbulent second half of the 18th century, the echoes of their political revolutions would sound throughout the world. Indeed, democracy and nationalism would become hallmarks of the modern era. In Europe, North America, and Japan, mass education spread literacy and gave citizens a more modern sense of a shared national identity. Darwin introduced his theory of evolution, challenging many cultural presuppositions. Population growth, combined with land shortages, increased taxation, and new opportunities in towns and cities, continued to undermine village life in most of the world. Soon, social tensions would explode in industrializing societies all over the globe. The period from the start of World War I through the end of World War II can best be described by the word stagnation. The unprecedented growth after industrialization declined throughout the world as global trade decreased dramatically and nations began to view each other with suspicion. The Great War, World War I, was the outcome. Never before had humans witnessed such bloody and awful combat. After the horrors of World War I, the Great Depression led to fascist governments first in Italy under Mussolini and later the Nazi Party under Hitler in Germany. It also coincided with the appearance in Russia of a Marxist-inspired socialist state, and soon Soviet communism would become a global alternative to capitalism. During the 1930s, all the major powers began to rearm in a build-up to World War II, which ended with the use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Afterwards, two new global economic superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, engaged in a global Cold War. Meanwhile, post-colonial independence movements began cropping up around the world, most notably in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Mass consumerism eventually provided a solution to the fundamental problem which had haunted producers during the 19th century. Mass consumption on a global scale was the capitalist system's most effective antidote to communist revolution. In many fields, the crisis period of 1914 to 1945 was also a period of cultural revolution, as seen by the theory of relativity advanced by Einstein, the development of quantum mechanics, Sigmund Freud's theory of the unconscious, literature, cinema, art, etc. The word contemporary means now. The contemporary subordinate era then extends from the end of World War II to now, at least according to Christian's account of world history. In the contemporary period, capitalist governments learned to manage economic growth even as their former colonies gained independence. During the Cold War, the capitalist and communist powers challenged each other militarily, economically, and politically. In the end, however, the command economy of the Soviet Union could not compete with the free markets championed by the United States and Western Europe. In 1991, the Soviet Union would collapse, leaving the few remaining communist states to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, in China, the disasters of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution encouraged a retreat from the Soviet ideal of total state control of the economy. After Mao's death in 1976, his successors cautiously reintroduced elements of a market economy and entrepreneurial activity, with a few failures, but also with some spectacularly significant successes. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Western values have spread as a result of the increasing interconnectedness of global systems. Some historians have used the term globalization to describe this process. Globalization is the fourth buzzword to record. As we shall see in the second semester of this course, however, the use of the term is fraught with difficulties. What is clear, though, is that globalization has generated a powerful backlash, as governments and citizens in some part of the world have tried to defend their traditional cultural and religious values against Western influence. Moreover, increasing inequalities have led some to challenge the value of modernity itself, both within and outside of Western societies. Since the second half of the 20th century, rapid population growth and increasing consumption have put new pressures on global biospheres. Today, burning large quantities of fossil fuels is affecting our climate. Limited natural resources are being consumed at unsustainably high levels, and many habitats occupied by humans are no longer available to other species. For Christian, this raises the question, are we burning the candle at both ends? In just about 3 centuries, we have seen the pace of change explode exponentially. Increasing the power and complexity of human communities brings many benefits to many people. At the same time, though, it brings many problems to some people and our planet. How will we manage such power and complexity? For how long will human beings survive into the future? You will have to answer these questions for yourselves, but my hope is that your study of world history in this course will help you determine your answers. Embedded within the word history is the word story. Like all storytelling, history requires a narrative structure, and periodization is the way in which historians create that structure. Periodization is the process of dividing time into discrete units or periods, beginning and ending with some significant turning point. Periodization, by the way, is the fifth and final buzzword. But what are the significant turning points? This is where historians disagree. In a day or two, you will read this section and you will learn how Christian describes the challenges of periodization. And in class, we will examine the different periodization schemes used throughout this course. But for now, just note that Christian identifies the theoretical, organizational, ethical, and technical problems of periodization before describing the ways in which famous historians around the world have addressed these problems. For Christian, however, the turning points of world history are threshold moments in big history. Please take a moment to look at the periodization scheme in the handout Big History 2 on the back of your notes from Friday. Note that each of the major eras of world history on the left represent one of the three threshold moments in big history. Now look at what he calls the subordinate eras. Notice that he subdivides each period into smaller sections of time, one followed by the next. Each subordinate era is marked by a relatively smaller turning point in human history. But time is only one way to subdivide a period. Indeed, as we will see on Tuesday, alternatives to time, such as space and themes, will be employed throughout this course and frequently in some combination. If all this seems overwhelming at this point, remember that what I want you to appreciate now is this key fact. The way in which we tell the story of the world is almost as important as what we tell in world history. To that end, I have a challenge for you, should you choose to accept it. For extra credit, write a one-paragraph summary of world history from the earliest humans to now. Your summary must be on a separate piece of paper. It must be at least 3 but not more than 5 sentences long, and it must include the second, third, and fourth buzzwords. Bring it with you on Monday along with your completed outline. Finally, let me point out that normally the weekend videocast will not be this long, I promise. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in class. This week we will examine the tools of the historian's trade, namely time, space, and themes. See you then.